Hello and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I'm an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple different reasons. The first of which is just to take my brain out of the mode of background work throughout the course of the week and move into the process of writing and preparing a sermon that I'll preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason. And the second is just to allow you, the viewer, who have graciously given of your time to come by and watch this video, whether this is the first time you've ever watched one or whether you've been a long-time viewer, to gain some different insight into this assigned text for the week. So that is why I do these. This particular Sunday, which is November 4th, 2018, what we call in my tradition All Saints Sunday, we will be focusing in and celebrating the lives of those who we believe have gone on before us into the great unknown, or into the promises of the resurrection that lie beyond death. So that's one thing that we do here in my tradition. Many traditions do it. November 1st is actually All Saints Day, and then so the first Sunday of November we tend to celebrate All Saints Sunday. So that's kind of what's going on. Along with that, there are some more specific, specialized texts that we will utilize rather than the regular calendar for the whatever Sunday after Pentecost. I think I want to say it was like the 24th Sunday after Pentecost. Need to look. Yeah, 24th Sunday after Pentecost. So there are assigned texts for that one as well. This is actually similar to last week with Reformation Sunday. If you happen to catch last week's video, I did the same sort of thing. Rather than using the Reformation Day text, I used the regular Sunday text. This time around, I'm using the All Saints Sunday text. So with that being said, the assigned text for this Sunday is John 11:32 through 44. Now, this is a portion of the story of the raising of Lazarus. Lazarus, if you are not familiar with who he is, Lazarus, along with his two sisters, Mary and Martha, live in the village of Bethany, which is just a couple of miles outside of Jerusalem. And they were very, very close friends of Jesus. We don't know how the connection began with them, but they do pop up. All three of these family members do pop up in various points throughout John's gospel. Now I'm blanking on if we actually hear about them in the Synoptic Gospels. We maybe do. I don't think we hear about Lazarus, but maybe Mary and Martha. I really feel like I should know this, and I'm utterly blanking, so pastor fail, but that happens sometimes. But we do hear about them quite a bit in John's Gospel. And in John's Gospel, Mary is the one who actually anoints Jesus with the perfume and wipes his feet with her hair. And that actually takes place just in the next chapter, in chapter 12. And in fact, at the beginning of this story, again, this is only a portion of this larger story, that's referenced. And then in the next chapter, this is referenced, so which is kind of funny. But so it would seem that when John was compiling the stories, there were references around of like, this is the person who did that, which you'll read about later. And when you read that, then we'll remember this and all kinds of that stuff. But I'm getting off track. So essentially what has gone on is we have this family that Jesus is quite close to. They seem to be a family with some wealth, with some means. Specifically Martha, it's referred to as in different times as the home of Martha. So it kind of raises the question of what were the family dynamics there typically. If the parents are gone and if there's not a husband around, which there doesn't seem to be, it would be the home of Lazarus, and the sisters would be living with him as a caretaker. But that does not seem to be the case. It seems to be that it's Martha's house, but that's again kind of going beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. So we hear that Lazarus gets sick. This happens at the beginning of chapter 11. And that they send word to Jesus wherever he's at. He's somewhere else. And when he hears that Lazarus is sick, he stays put. He doesn't go anywhere for a couple of days. And then then from wherever he's at, then to get to Bethany, where Lazarus lives, it takes a while. So by the time he arrives, Lazarus has already been dead and buried for the period of 4 days. So that's some of the background that's going on prior to where we will pick up. And some of the other things that happen is as Jesus approaches, Martha receives word that he's coming, and she goes out and meets him, and she kind of gives him she's kind of slamming him a little bit. And she makes a statement that we'll actually hear the same thing from Mary when we pick up, so I'm not going to go into that in depth. But so there's an exchange between Martha and Jesus, and then that kind of goes back and forth. They start talking about the resurrection, and do you believe that your brother will live again? Jesus makes one of his I am statements that are common in John, and then they send word to Mary that Jesus is coming. So that's where we're going to pick up. So that's some of the background that's happened in the first part of the chapter that I think is important, because Martha's reaction is very similar to Mary's, which I think is oftentimes common of our reaction when a death occurs that perhaps is I was going to say an out of the ordinary death, and not that any death is ordinary, but some of them, I'm digging myself into a hole here. Let's talk about death, because that's one of the things that All Saints really focuses in on. Even though we're celebrating the life, it's because of death that we recognize that. No death is good, but some deaths feel better than others. If it's at the end of a long, hard disease or at the end of a long, full life. Maybe those ones don't sting quite as much. They still do. There's still a reaction. There's still mourning. There's still pain that death causes. And yet, maybe those ones don't sting as bad as one that's a tragic, an accident or the death of a young person. Oftentimes we struggle to make sense of. And that's really applicable within my congregation, or more so within my community, not necessarily my congregation, but the community itself. My community is very small. Less than 1,000 people live in the town where my church is located. But just a couple of weeks ago, we had the death of a high school student in a car accident that we're really still feeling in the community and still kind of reeling from. And so even though the individual and her family are not part of my congregation, they're still part of the community that we share, and so that affects us as well. And so perhaps we're asking these same questions of and the question is, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That's what both Martha and Mary say. And maybe we ask the similar question of, where were you on this one, Lord? Why didn't you intervene? If you had acted, this wouldn't have happened. And so that's something that I'm kind of thinking about. Now, before I actually read the passage out of John, one of the other passages, because there's always 3 assigned plus a psalm, it comes out of Revelation, and it's Revelation 21, which is right at the end of Revelation. And in my opinion, is the hopeful part of Revelation. If you're familiar with Revelation, it's a weird book. We actually just wrapped up a Bible study on Revelation in my congregation, and we all agreed that there's some weird stuff in here, and yet there's some hopeful stuff too. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "The home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more." And here's the part that I'm really kind of latching onto. "Mourning and crying and pain will be no more." We hear that death will go away, and with that, no more mourning, no more crying, no more pain. The pain of death is real. Sometimes we allow ourselves to feel it, sometimes we don't. But grief, mourning, pain demands to be felt. And if we don't allow ourselves to go through that process, it can often come out in really unhealthy ways. And that's something that I think is important to realize, that what is the promise of God? What is the promise of the resurrection? Whatever that's going to look like. And it seems to be that the anguish, the pain that we feel when we encounter death, not our own, but the death of someone that we care about, that it causes a reaction. Now, okay, before I go any farther, it's been almost 10 minutes that I've been talking. I haven't even read the passage yet, and I need to, because Jesus' reaction with him is important. So, okay, John 11, 32 through 44. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Better translation of that, he was moved to anger, or he was moved to indignation, or he was greatly disturbed within his spirit. So Jesus himself has a emotional reaction. He said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. So Jesus mourns. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, same deal, same deeply agitated, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. Okay, so that's the passage. And what I'm really zeroing in on, in terms of this sermon, and honestly, I've gone this direction in the past with this passage as well, is that we have the tendency to question God when things that are beyond our ability to understand or comprehend or deal with occur. And death is one of them, especially when it's a tragic death. And it would seem that Lazarus, we don't know how old they are, but it seems to be a little bit of a tragic situation. That Jesus, you could have done something. We sent you word when he was sick. We know you've healed before. You could have done something about this. And Jesus reacts, and not so much to like them crabbing at him or being angry with him, but Jesus, who is God in flesh, the Word made flesh, God reacts. God gets stirred up. God has this painful reaction to death, like we heard about in Revelation. And God mourns. I think this is reassuring for us when we encounter situations like that, is that we are not alone in our grief. We are not alone in the pain and in the mourning that we feel, that God feels it too. And I often say in funeral situations that the first being who mourned this death was God. I believe that to be true, that even before we have the chance, even before our comprehension can realize the meaning of that this person that I care about, this person that I love has died, God has already mourned that death. And yet God has done something about it. And that's the hope that's in this passage. Now there's two sides to that coin. And I fully expect to acknowledge that we do question. We don't always just feel the hope, oh goody goody, everything is fine because God has promised that there is more. Though that is there, and that hope is there, and we do turn to that, and yet we also acknowledge the pain and the way that pain is expressed of where were you on this one, God. And if we learn anything from the reaction of Martha and Mary, Martha who we don't hear in this part, but Mary's reaction that we do hear, is that we can put those questions to God, and that God will take them, and God will not condemn us for asking those questions. So that's where I'm going with this passage. It's an important one to really wrestle with, because death is a reality. It's a painful one, and we acknowledge that, but we also turn to what the gospel tells us, that there is more, that the last word does not belong to death. So if you have thoughts or questions or comments, throw them down in the comment section. We can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we will catch you next time.